Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the Lanier Theological Library and a former dean up there in Wheaton at the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. Our purpose in these podcasts is really very simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it, but to live it. Joining me today on Exegetically Speaking is Vuyani Sindo. He is a senior lecturer, and he's the head of biblical studies at George Whitefield College in Cape Town, South Africa. Vuyani, it's great to see you.
So good to be here. It's really, I've been a fan of the podcast, and it's so good to be part of it today.
Oh, we're so glad that you're here to be a part of it. And you're here to do a lecture at the Lanier Theological Library in the fall of 2021.
Yes, I will be talking about wisdom in leadership, and it's just wonderful to be here.
And you'll be talking with a colleague. We're actually doing 2 lectures for the price of 1.
Yes.
Yeah. Now tell me, how did you get started reading Greek?
So at George Whitefield College, you don't have an option to choose not to do Greek. So David Seckham, who was a principal at the time, just in my interview to be a student, he tried to sell to me the idea of the importance of ancient languages, especially Greek and Hebrew. And then the first week you come to George Whitefield College for a week, from 8 in the morning up until 4:30 in the afternoon.
Wow.
You do Greek for the first week of your studies there. So that's how I got into Greek. Hebrew was nice, but I didn't do well as Greek. So I didn't keep my Hebrew as much as I would like to have. But Greek, on the other hand, kept it since I was a student.
It was easier than the Hebrew?
I found Greek easier than Hebrew, even though it has more grammatical rules than Hebrew, I think. But it was actually easy. Maybe it's one of those things because it was my first language I was taught, and it was so intense the first year, I was able to remember it better than Hebrew.
But you speak another, how many languages?
4 to 5.
Okay,
yeah.
So what are those languages that you speak?
So it's, of course, English. And then there's Xhosa, Zulu. And then there's also Ndebele and Swati in South Africa, which is more in the southern part of South Africa.
But in terms of biblical languages, it was Greek that was the first
Greek was the one that for me that did it.
Well, today we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 4. You've got an idea there that I think is fascinating that we're going to talk about. So set up, what are we looking at in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 4?
So, I mean, you have, let me just give you a little bit of a context before we look at the verse. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, you have the Corinthians insisting on their rights, that we have a right to eat food offered to idols, because we know an idol is nothing. And Paul has been trying to help this young congregation to realize that in your use of your rights, there should not be a stumbling block to your brothers and sisters. And he ends chapter 8 with a verse that I think many of us who love our meat, especially steak, will be hard. And he says, if eating meat causes my brother or sister to stumble, I'll never eat meat again. And then when you come to chapter 9, Paul uses 15 rhetorical questions. 15 rhetorical questions. Most of them begin with uk. And then, of course, when Paul uses uk within a rhetorical question, the expectation is that we'll agree with him that these are the rights he has. So in chapter 9, he talks about the various rights that he has as an apostle. But for me, what was interesting, and then of course, when you come to verse 4 of chapter 9, Paul uses a double particle, negative particle, the man and the uk again. So there, he's very emphatic about what he's about to say, and the Corinthians surely should agree with him. And then there's an interesting word in the offline when we're chatting that he uses as well in verse 4 and 5, which is the word ἐξουσία. And of course, that word he first uses is in chapter 8. And many of us, especially your first Greek primers that you learn ἐξουσία as authority.
Right.
But if you go to Bedect and others, you realize that it has a much more broader semantic range than just authority. But what was interesting for me in just looking at this term is how, for example, the NRSV in its use of in translation in chapter 8, it translated it as liberty, and then it changed it when it comes to chapter 9. And there's no note or anything to tell you why they are changing it, which for me was again interesting, because again, look at the semantic range you can get here, and various English translations will have it. So some will translate it as liberty, others will translate it as freedom, authority, and then of course others, they even use the word power. And now when you look at the context of chapter 8, you start to wonder, now what is Paul getting at here? And then again, some people, when they study Greek, they have this lexical approach that I tend to tell it. When I teach my students, I tell them actually context is key when you do ancient languages.
Yes.
So for you to understand better what Paul is getting at here, you have to look at the context. And the key for me to give me a clear idea how now I ought to understand exousia and how it's been used in chapter 9 became that strange verse, which is verse 9 of chapter 9. I'll just read it in English, which says, "For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an oxen while it's treading out the grain." Is it about an oxen that God is concerned about? Which basically here what Paul is doing within the context of chapter 9 is going to appeal to the law of Moses about the various rights that he has. And then basically he says what he's arguing for is that, listen, I have all these rights, but I've not used them for the sake of the gospel. And in verse 23, he tells us that was the motivation. So now when I looked at all of that, I looked at how now I ought to understand verse 4, where I have the various meanings that are available to me in light of the verse 9, which gives me a much more of a clear key of how I ought to understand the chapter. So it made me to see that actually Paul was talking about is that he is legally entitled. So that's a translation I put in light of verse 9, so that Paul is legally entitled to food and drink. He is legally entitled, of course, because he places in the negative as a rhetorical question. So the positive, I'm placing it more in the positive, is that he is legally entitled to all these things. And then, of course, for the sake of the gospel, he didn't do that. The reason I prefer that, I think both within American context and South African context, I mean, where white democracy is new, we love our legal rights and our legal entitlements. I think Americans, you talk a lot about your First Amendment right, your Second Amendment rights, and how at times this can divide the community.
It can.
And Paul says, actually, for the sake of the gospel, even the things that he's legally entitled to, he is willing to put them aside.
I have never heard it put exactly like that. I like that reading of it. That's very helpful. Very helpful. And that word ἐξουσία, it has a broad semantic range.
It does. And I mean, we don't have time now to even talk about how he uses it in chapter 7, which will be another interesting time.
We'll have to do that again on another time. Vuyani Sindo, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks to Ian Rosine, Rebecca Larson, and Silvio Vasquez, who help us produce this podcast. Thanks as well to John Lansma, our Wheaton-based director, who makes this podcast possible. We're grateful to Phil Keggy for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, then you need to consider Wheaton College. Whether you're an undergraduate or a graduate student, we have amazing programs, a first-rate faculty, and some of the best students in the world. So go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. If you have questions about this or any of our podcasts, we'd love to hear from you. If you have suggestions or questions about any passage in the Hebrew Bible or Greek New Testament, send us an email and we'll see if we can get one of our experts to weigh in on that for you. Our email is exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.